The Rebel Capitalist Show. Okay, and just FYI, I don't know if you saw the New York Times article. I think it was yesterday, the day prior, but Krugman came out and admitted that he was wrong about inflation. So that's probably the biggest contrarian indicator out there, meaning that when the CARES Act was going through and all this, he thought, oh, don't worry about inflation, don't worry about inflation, don't worry about inflation. And then he's coming out now and saying that he was wrong. And so, again, that's probably peak inflation right there.
Right.
Right?
That's anyway, the thing that we it's so silly but it's really tragic because you think about really the underlying economic fundamentals here is that we went into the 2020 pandemic overreaction in not a very good place to start with. I mean, the economy had never recovered from 2008, and then we imposed upon it massive costs, including expansion of the federal government's deficits, which, as Japan has taught us, is only going to be deflationary, depressing down the road. So we go into 2020, and then things start moving back. We get reopening, and there's all this other stuff. Then early 2021, consumer prices start to accelerate, and everybody starts to think that we were actually going to make it through 2020 without suffering any permanent damage from it. And that was always, a very low probability. And I think that's part of what's spooking the markets is that now that this, supply shock dynamic is coming off the boil and the economies are starting to revert to their mean, what is the mean that we're reverting to? What if the mean that we're reverting to is something substantially worse than the pre-2020 baseline? What if once we get past all this artificial government interference, the economy really is incredibly damaged? I mean, we know it is.
Yeah,
How many small businesses were just completely destroyed by the pandemic overreaction, by the politics of it?
There's a misallocation of resources and malinvestment. I mean, just go down the line.
On top of that, it's been a windfall to the least productive economic sectors like oil. It's been great to be Saudi Arabia or Russia, but that doesn't help the global economic sustainability over the next 10 years or so. Yeah. So we've done everything wrong for the last 2 years, and then doing everything wrong from a very difficult place to begin with. And so I understand why markets are hedged the way they're hedged. Once we revert to the mean, that mean might be very ugly.
Yeah, but it's almost like they're saying or predicting that that the economy, the underlying economy, or what we will go to is the underlying economy that we would have had without the central planning intervention of 2020. So just imagine what the economy would have done. Just go back to when the lockdowns, when they lock everyone in a cage, they shut down all the global supply chains, they shut down the entire global economy. And how deflationary would that have been? Just minus the stimmies, minus the PPP, minus the Fed backstopping. And maybe that's what the markets are now predicting that we're going to move into as far as an economic environment.
Yeah, and I think that's the counter argument that they'll make is that they wanted to prevent that kind of thing happening. So if it is actually happening and all they did was kick the can down the road, then it would have been better to get it done and over with in 2020 to let the market clear out all the stuff. Although that would have been incredibly difficult with the government interfering in all sorts of ways. But
I would have argued that they shouldn't have locked everyone in a cage to begin with.
Well, yeah. But that's the thing. I mean, that once that tactic was unleashed, there was no going back. I mean, that was essentially the kill shot to the economy for much of it anyway, at the margins. Yeah. So once they did that, I mean, it was sort of like let's get it done and over with. Rip the Band-Aid off and hopefully hope for the best here, because I think that's exactly what the markets and the curves are. And this is not just the U.S. This is the entire global economy we're talking about here, where the markets are looking at it and saying, if we had a 1-year temporary reprieve or 18-month temporary reprieve because of all the government action, and all it did was buy us 18 months for nothing, then we're just going to experience where we would have been anyway. I think that, the long run economic damage by doing that is even worse than had they done nothing.
Oh, I agree. So then that takes us into the policy response. So let's assume that we're going into this, massive economic depression, not just a mild, couple quarters here, but we go into a heavy duty recession that even the White House has to admit. What's the policy response? I mean, is it CARES Act 2.0? Is it 10 trillion? in stimmy checks or PPP? And is the Fed doing, 200 billion in QE and dropping rates down to zero or maybe even negative? And along with the supply chains being broken and most likely being damaged even further, you restrict supply. Does that give us another massive supply shock on top of heavy duty demand? And we go into like 1947. And you know what I'm talking about, where inflation then, because that supply shock or whatever the reason, spikes up to 19.5. And then 2 years later, it's at -3 again.
Yeah, that's the 1940s after World War II. Even during World War II, there's a supply shock spike in consumer prices in 1943 when the U.S. entered the war, rationing.
Yeah, there was really three of them. For the viewers who don't know the chart, there's three of them there. There's one at the beginning, a huge one in 47, and then you get 3% deflation, and then a couple of years later, you go right back into another spike that got up to, I don't know, 12, 13.
Yeah, they make the current CPI look like nothing. I mean, it's sad. I mean, I don't know, 9% isn't nothing, but compared to 19.25 or whatever it was, that's nothing. And the reason is because it was more about the economic situation at the time rather than anything. It wasn't over aggressive Federal Reserve policies or actual bank credit expansion. It was simply the kind of what we see now. So I can understand, George, why you're thinking, hey, this could end up being more like the 1940s.
And simply put, we go into 2023 and they increase demand again and decrease supply.
And I think that's the risk where I would not disagree, but I think the other part of the probability there is that because of what happened last year and this year, the political context has changed, where the Republican Party, who are likely going to get majority of Congress, are going to say no. Democrats, absolutely, they're going to say yes. We need CARES Act too. We need, hell with that. We need universal basic income. They're going to try to push this further along down that road, and I think the Republicans are going to say no. Are you crazy? Did you not see what happened in 2021 with consumer prices? And I think Republicans can galvanize enough public support for their position where it might mute some of the impact of the federal government's response. So we might not get the same 2020 level of intervention simply because everybody now thinks they did too much. And of course they did. Everybody now thinks they did too much. And that's kind of accepted by a lot of people. Nobody wants to see gasoline prices go to $10 a gallon because it was ultimately destructive at $5 a gallon. Mm-hmm. So it might be that part of the government says, we want to do massive amounts of stimulus. And the other parts of the government say, we're never going to vote for it because you guys screwed that up last time.
Okay, then what about the Fed? And I know that they don't matter because they're not a central bank, but I'm talking about they do matter for the stock market from a psychological standpoint. So let's say the Fed comes in and says, okay, we're going to take we took our balance sheet down to whatever 8 by the time this happens. So now we're going to take our balance sheet up to 15 trillion or whatever it is. Does the stock market rebound just because that Pavlovian effect?
It might, and it's possible. I mean, I remember back in 2010. Summer of 2010, we just went through a repo crisis. Was not about Greek debt. It was about repo collateral shortage. We had the flash crash in May of 2010. It was only a year after the global financial crisis had ended, and the economy was not recovering. Everything looked really bad. And I thought, yeah, we're going to get another downward leg in stocks. But what happened? The Fed did, late August of 2010, Ben Bernanke shows up at Jackson Hole and hints at QE2. And the stocks just take off.
Right.
They go through the moon because of that sentimental psychological effect. And so you can't discount that. But the other case, the flip side case to that is Japan. Japanese stocks did very poorly during the QE periods because they're more fundamental. Maybe they're not susceptible. There's more of an institutional bias in Japanese stocks, whatever the case may be. But George, I would expect if things do get bad over the next 6 months and into next year, that the Fed isn't going to just do regular QE because they can't. Remember, this is psychological. They cannot continue to do the same things over and over.
You got to do more of it or new. Yeah.
More of it or something new. So I would expect that the Fed is going to say, well, we'll buy X number of treasuries, we'll buy X number of MBS, but now we're going to start buying ETFs.
Right.
We got to do something. We got to do something brand new and shocking. And so I would expect the Fed is going to come up with whatever. And it could have a short run impact on the stock market and other risky asset classes because, certainly on this side of the Pacific, there's a lot of appetite for what the Fed sells. So possibly, but you have to wonder, can the Fed do it before the stock market enters a further decline, or will it come afterward? And again, you have to wonder if the Fed is going to be late to respond because of how it's being perceived as creating this inflationary environment to begin with. So maybe they're going to be a little bit gun shy about going to more extreme measures and try to do this willy-nilly fine-tuning. Oh, we'll cut rates a little bit. That's monetary policy environment that looks more like, late 2007 and early 2008, rather than going full on to 11 from the get-go.
Right. So from what I'm hearing, we go into a recession and then the government's response is less than it was potentially, or the probability, the government's response is less than it was CARES Act. So although that might keep us from going into a deflationary environment, outright deflation, maybe that keeps up the CPI at 2% or 3%, because again, my concern there is the supply chains. As we can talk about the demand side, but if supply is decreasing as a result of what they're doing in the government intervention, that's still going to add a tailwind, let's say, to consumer prices. So that's why I hesitate to go absolute deflation, although obviously it's possible if you look at the 1940s for sure. But they're not able to do enough of a CARES Act to take us up to that next, 10%, 12%. If we're looking at the 1940s and 1947, right? That middle spike that really goes up high. But then the Fed, so let's say CPI is now at 3% or 4%. Then the Fed comes in and says, okay, well, we'll do whatever we need to do because we see the CPI trending down, and they come in and start buying equities because they'll just say wealth effect, something like that.
Yeah, I think that the issue then is timing, and I think that's the downside problem. And that's really part of the issue with the 1940s, is that everything was thrown out of whack. Where you had normally you had smooth business cycles where everything was sort of timed together or put together. Where, obviously World War II and the destruction that had across the world threw everything out of whack. So demand came back much sooner than supply could. And that was the difference that led to rising consumer prices.
And the price controls, right? They took out the price controls before 47?
In the 1940s. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So once that happened, it was, consumer prices just took off. And the other thing is that they didn't just take off and come right back down. As you said, it was a 2-year period where consumer prices were up for quite a long period of time. Even by I think it was early half of 1948, we still had double-digit CPI. So it was a relatively unstable period. And I think that's kind of what we're kind of beating around the bush here, George. Is what we're saying is what we're looking at is potentially a period of even greater instability, not just in terms of economy, but also consumer prices, which just makes everything worse.
Right.
When I sit back and look at the way the curves are shaped today, compared to where they had been in similar time periods over the last 15 years, similar circumstances, what the curves are saying is that the 2020s look to be either more uncertain or potentially worse than the 2010s had been, which is, you think that, how can that possibly be? The 2010s were the worst economic decade since the 1930s. So how can we get worse than the last decade? And the answer is the 1940s. If we're gonna add another element of price instability on top of lack of economic growth, that would certainly fit the bill, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.